I don't have to draw the whole tile all the way across to give you the impression that the line continues all the way across. You just sort of like see the lines and you finish it in your head. So anyway, let's think about like where we want these eyes to go. So I'm thinking maybe we even, actually that's not bad. The challenge is going to be, oh, I like that actually. That's kind of cool. Like sometimes it comes down to like, okay, does the head need to be 1 pixel wider for me to communicate this, or 1 pixel narrower? You know, like you can make those big changes and it'll feel like they're huge. It'll feel like it's too big of a change, right? Sometimes. But ultimately, it's about what the sprite looks like at the end, not what the sprite kind of looks like in relation to, like, I don't know, any conception that you had prior to that point. So, you know, be prepared to change things up and see how it looks. And I'm always like zooming in and out, right, to like have a look at this stuff and like reassess, like, okay, where am I? How is this looking? Like, is it closer or further when I do this? Like maybe she's got these sort of like librarian half moon glasses, right, which gives us a little more space to work with up the top. It's like Dumbledore style, which makes her look a little bit more like a librarian. You know, you play with it. Maybe that's when you bring in like a backpack to reinforce it, if you really love this face enough. And so a backpack she will have. And let's make sure it doesn't look like a vest. So we can kind of like extend it way back here. And it's kind of fine because we've got so much space to play with on the silhouette that we're okay here. And I would say probably also worth shading as well. If you want to focus on this edge, what's really important with pixel art is she holding a baguette? No, it's a pencil. I've done a bad job of communicating that because it's not finished yet. The shape's not great for it. A couple things that I wanted to draw out here as we finish up on this character design. Things that are pretty fundamental to the process of coming up with a good image and something that reads well. Contrast is super important, and those Gestalt principles. To go into them a little bit more, let's look very quickly. Basically, design principles that were originally thought up in the early 20th century. I think it overlaps with Bauhaus, but basically there are these principles of how your brain processes images into separate objects. So closure, you know, you see a square here, even though the lines don't actually make a square, they make a bunch of random lines. Common regions, so we're talking about grouping, you know, these dots feel separate to these dots because of this rectangle in the background. Proximity. Now I talk about these in the context of character design because I think it goes beyond, like those are really good examples, but contrast in general is just a really important factor when you're doing any kind of art or design and you want to draw the attention to something. So like if I want you to specifically look at the character's eyes, having the character's eyes be darker than everything else on the head makes them stand out, right? Your eyes are probably going to be drawn to this point. In fact, right now they're probably drawn to this point, which might be advantageous in some games, but not really where I want you to look in this game. So I might be inclined to like actually brighten up some of this to soften that contrast because I don't want it to actually be the focal point. Not in this game anyway. You know, maybe instead I really want you to look at the character's eyes, so I choose like the darkest color I have. And now suddenly you're looking up here a lot more. Eyes up here, guys. That comes down to palette choice, it comes down to color choice, and it's a conscious decision that you make. When we're doing any kind of pixel art, what's really important is to understand what contrast does. So if I have a really dark color, right, and I want to show you that this cube is sharp, The way I do that is I pick a color that is really light, and I pick a color that's really dark, and I put them right next to each other. That makes it feel like all of the light that's coming from the top is hitting this surface directly at like perpendicular. And all of that light completely misses this because it's parallel. The more perpendicular you place an edge to the light, the more of that light is going to bounce directly off it, right? And come back at the opposite angle, or at the original angle. So if I wanted this to feel more like a ball, right, the same shape, I would basically start filling in the next, like that space, with other shades, right? Suddenly this is looking more round. And it's looking more round because before we had this idea visually that our edge was like, if this is the light coming down, this was one edge and this was the next edge. And so all of the light was passing straight by this edge here. But now we've got this idea of there being like a rounded edge, right? So like some of the light comes right back. And then some of the light goes this way and this way and this way and this way, right? And so if our eye is here, we're getting like all of the light and then some of it and then some less and then less and then none, which is why you would then have these shades. So the colors that you choose and the contrast informs edges, and edges are what our brain is designed to use to like identify things in images. The like where one thing stops and the next thing begins is really important in our brain. It's how we understand shapes. So you can use that to your advantage in pixel art. This is a more general point right now. But if I really wanted to highlight this edge, I would pick an even lighter shade and just hit the very edge. We call this specular light. It's the impression that maybe like the light is actually coming from like this exact angle. In actual fact, the corner had like a slight roundedness to it, and it was on that slight roundedness that all the light was coming back. And this is still reflecting a little light, and this is still reflecting basically none, but that edge right there is what reflects like direct light. So you can use that to sort of like really, really highlight that edge and make it feel sharp. You can go even further if you want, but you have to use fewer and fewer pixels to do that. So that's basically how you guide the eye around an image. And then as a designer, it's your responsibility to think about the kinds of materials and shapes and objects that you're going to use to build your character out of, to then use those techniques to draw the characters of the player's eye around, to look at specific things and not other things. Right now, like for example, I'm using a shadow, this color here, right, to draw basically almost like an outline around the face, to say, hey, this is where the edge is between the hair and the face. And if I was being really smart, what I would do is use the hair at its brightest to meet that edge. Now it's like really sharp. And I'd be very careful about how I feather that out. So maybe we keep it like this, and like just suggest that there's this like invisible line coming up like this, but actually it's just the start and the end of one, right? I do that a lot as well. This is that same thing, right? We were talking about the law of closure, right? I use the law of closure all the time. You see these tiles on these buildings? Law of closure, right there, right? I don't have to draw the whole tile all the way across to give you the impression that the line continues all the way across. You just sort of like see the lines and you finish it in your head. You see the grain and you think, oh, because of these 3 pixels here, the rest of the board must have grains in it that I just can't see. But they're there and I'm gonna appreciate them regardless. Same thing with these bricks, right? I don't have to draw all of the brick, right? All of the rectangle to tell you that there's a full brick here. I just have to show you some of the brick. And that helps immensely to mitigate the effects of what happens when you have such a small amount of space within which to convey whatever you're trying to convey. Because you can think about how much darker would this be if I've continued all of the bricks. Think of how many more darker pixels I have to then commit, right? And how much noisier does this become visually? It draws way more attention to your eye when all the bricks are completed than when they are incomplete. Because I want to draw your attention to things like the door. I don't want you to look at the bricks. I want you to understand that the bricks are there and how they work and what they're made of, and to suggest things like that. But that's not my focus. So you can choose to use like alternating colors here. You don't have to use like the same color. You can like guide the eye around however you want. It's up to you. You're going to get really used to being judicious about like, okay, can I afford for this to be this dark? Can I afford to have this be something that is drawing the eye's focus in order to explain what it is? Or should I keep it undetailed to communicate to the player that it's not that important to look at? It's the same with the palette. It's the same with character design. It's the choices that you make. Let's say we were happy with this character. There are so many things you could do to sharpen off this and make it look really, really special. I think there are some things that I would do personally to sort of like, maybe if this was an idle pose, I really want to see this pencil tip. I wonder what the character would look like against a white background, against a dark background. These things would then inform our choices of the level design, you know, which colors we use for the rest of the level. Maybe, you know, if we're making our game, we want to use more of a sky blue for the backgrounds. These things can't be done in isolation. These are things that we, when we're designing our game, think about all together before we move forward to do any kind of animation or any kind of terrain design or that kind of thing. If we really, really wanted to, if we decided, for example, that this character needed an outline, we can do that. We can give it an outline. We can make that outline bright. We can make that outline dark. We can be selective about that outline. I think that outline looks really nice. It's a pretty common technique and it works on a light background. You might be inclined to also extend that background, that outline, to the internal lines to show the difference between the hand holding the pencil and the pencil itself. Cat5 says, do you ever limit the detail in the character because it makes animating it harder? This is a really important decision. This is something that if you are making a game, especially if you're making a game solo, you want to make the choices early on how detailed things are, because you don't want to get caught in a scenario where you are unable to like fulfill like the level of detail consistently across the game because you established a style that was too detailed. For sure. That's definitely something that you should be considerate of. Be realistic. This character is pretty simple. It's simple because of what we were thinking about the game, the theme of the game would be. And so we had this idea of a romance game, and we would keep the palette quite simple. I'd probably then go back and start like wearing away at some of these, and I would just start thinking about how we could use fewer colors to show more. But at this point, like, I think we're okay. I think we did a good job. Hey pal, thanks for watching, and thanks most especially to the patrons and Twitch subs who support this channel and my game dev project Insignia. To find out more, click the links in the description below. And if you like this video, tell YouTube by clicking the like button, and then YouTube will tell me, and then I'll make more videos. That's nice.